It's honestly a bit staggering when you think about it. How much the very start of our lives can, well, sort of dictate our well-being way down the line.
It really is.
I mean, think about this. One big study found almost 2/3 of adults, like 64%, said they'd experienced some kind of major childhood adversity.
Yeah. And that's not just about, bad memories. It really hints at how deep those early years can cut, shaping our mental health for decades.
Absolutely. The ripples just keep spreading out, don't they?
Yeah.
Potential long-term effects that can really set the stage for later mental health issues.
That's right. It lays down tracks in a way.
And that's exactly what we're digging into today. We want to explore how these different types of, let's call them tough childhood experiences, can impact adult mental health.
Mm-hmm.
It's about understanding those connections, right, between early challenges and maybe a higher chance of facing mental disorders later on.
Exactly. And we'll also look at how these experiences might actually change the brain long term.
Oh, wow. Okay. And also why someone with that kind of history might respond differently to, say, therapy or medication.
Precisely. And our exploration today, it's based on some really solid recent research. We've looked at longitudinal studies, the ones that follow people over many, many years.
Right, seeing how things unfold.
Yes. And also neurobiological research using tools like functional MRI, fMRI, which gives us a peek inside the brain's activity.
Okay, great. So let's start with the basics. When we say early life stress, or ELS, what kind of things fall under that umbrella?
Well, essentially, ELS refers to significant negative experiences during childhood. So we usually define it as experiencing sexual, physical, or emotional abuse, and also neglect.
Neglect, that's a big one, too.
A huge one. Both physical neglect, like not having basic needs met, and also emotional neglect, that absence of support and warmth.
And it sounds like these things aren't exactly rare. The numbers are pretty sobering, aren't they?
They really are. If you look at data from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, this was back in 2012, looking at Child Protective Services referrals, it was concerning.
What did it show?
A huge chunk, nearly 80%, were related to neglect. Physical abuse was around 18%, sexual abuse about 9%.
Wow. Mostly neglect.
Mostly neglect in the reported cases. And importantly, we have to assume these official numbers are probably, an undercount. Lots goes unreported.
That makes sense. It's often hidden. And this connects to the ACE study, right? The Adverse Childhood Experiences study?
Exactly. The CDC Kaiser Permanente AC study, that was really groundbreaking. They looked at over 17,000 adults.
And they categorized different types of adversity.
Yes, 10 types. The abuses we mentioned, physical, emotional, sexual, but also other big stressors like substance abuse in the home, a parent in prison, mental illness in the family, domestic violence, losing a parent, whether through death or divorce, and both emotional and physical neglect were on that list too.
Right. And the big takeaway from the ACE study was...
Yeah, really significant findings. One key thing was the cumulative effect. The more ACEs someone reported, the higher their risk for both mental and physical health problems as an adult.
So it stacks up.
It really does. Experiencing 4 or more ACEs specifically significantly boosted the likelihood of psychiatric or medical disorders, and not just a little bit.
Okay, so that's a really strong indicator.
Yeah.
Early trauma links to later health issues. Now let's dive deeper into the mental health connection. What about specific adult disorders?
Right. So there's been a lot of work on this. A major review, a systematic review and meta-analysis pulled together findings from lots of those longitudinal studies we mentioned.
The ones tracking people over time.
Oh, exactly. And this review looks specifically for links between childhood or adolescent adversity and later diagnoses of mood disorders like depression or psychotic disorders like schizophrenia in adulthood.
And what stood out? What experiences seemed most strongly linked?
They found significant links for several things. Bullying was one, whether being the victim, the perpetrator, or just how often it happened. Also, emotional abuse, physical neglect, not having basic needs met, losing a parent, and this broader category they called general maltreatment, which could cover a mix of things.
Yeah, that's quite a range of difficulties popping up as risk factors.
It is. And what's really interesting is the evidence for that dose-response relationship again.
Meaning, the more types of trauma, the higher the risk.
Precisely. The more different forms of maltreatment someone went through, the higher their odds of developing a mental disorder. For those with multiple types, the odds were more than tripled. It really shows how these things can compound.
That really drives home the cumulative impact.
Right.
Now, you mentioned that in this specific review, physical and sexual abuse didn't show that strong link. That seems counterintuitive. Why might that be?
Yeah, the researchers flagged that themselves. They suggested it might be down to how those adversities were measured in the studies they included.
How so?
Often, physical and sexual abuse data came from official records, like Child Protective Services or court documents.
Ah, okay. Which might only capture reported cases, maybe the more severe ones?
Exactly. It likely misses a lot of cases that weren't reported or didn't make it into official systems. So the lack of a strong signal in that analysis might be a measurement issue.
That makes sense. So what about other research? Do other analyses show links for physical and sexual abuse?
Oh, absolutely. Other meta-analyses definitely highlight those connections. For instance, one found that adults with a documented history of childhood maltreatment had double the odds of major depression and any anxiety disorder.
Okay, so other studies confirm it.
Yes. And if you look at the research specifically on psychosis, meta-analyses there consistently find significant links between various childhood traumas, including maltreatment, bullying, parental loss, and developing psychotic disorders. So the overall picture across different studies is pretty consistent.
Right, so the pattern holds. Early adversity significantly bumps up the risk for a range of adult mental health problems.
Okay.
Let's switch gears a bit and talk about the brain. How could these early experiences actually, physically change how our brains work long term?
This is where it gets really fascinating and where those fMRI studies are so valuable. One study, for example, used resting state fMRI that's looking at brain activity when someone isn't doing a specific task.
Sort of like the brain's baseline communication.
Exactly. They looked at the long-term effects of different subtypes of childhood trauma on how adult brains function at this baseline level.
And what did they find? Did trauma leave a general mark?
Well, first, they did find that childhood trauma overall seemed to have a negative impact, correlating with more symptoms of depression and anxiety in the adults. Higher trauma scores linked to higher depression and anxiety scores.
Okay, fits.
But the really interesting part was that they started seeing different patterns depending on whether the primary trauma was neglect versus abuse.
Okay. That's a key distinction. So neglect the absence of something might affect the brain differently than abuse the presence of harm.
It seems that way. They found that higher scores for childhood neglect were linked with increased network transmission efficiency in brain regions involved in cognitive control and executive functions.
Increased efficiency. It sounds good. What areas are we talking about?
Areas like parts of the temporal lobe, the insular cortex, and the parahippocampal gyrus. Now, increased efficiency here might not be simply good.
Okay, break that down for us. What do those parts do, and why might neglect change them that way?
Right. So the insular cortex is crucial for, internal awareness, self-regulation, understanding emotions. The superior temporal gyrus processes sound. Language changes there have even been linked to things like hallucinations. The parahippocampal gyrus deals with memory, navigating space.
All right.
The idea, or one interpretation, is that if a child isn't getting the expected input, the care, the stimulation, their brain might adapt by making these cognitive systems work, maybe overly efficiently, almost like trying to compensate internally for what's missing externally.
Like the brain overdeveloping certain internal processing to fill a void.
That's interesting. It's one way to think about the potential adaptation, yes.
Okay, so that's neglect. What about abuse? How did that show up differently in the brain scans?
Childhood abuse, on the other hand, seemed more tied to reorganizations in brain areas related to what the researchers called less mature defense mechanisms and problems with representing emotions.
Less mature defenses.
Yeah.
Problems representing emotions. That sounds really impactful. What specific changes did they see with abuse?
Well, emotional and physical abuse were linked to that increased network efficiency again, but this time in visual and language processing areas.
Okay, visual and language. Why might that be?
This could potentially explain why people who've experienced abuse are often hypersensitive to threat cues in their environment. Their visual and language systems might be sort of primed to detect danger, on high alert.
That makes a lot of intuitive sense. Always scanning for threats. What else?
They also saw changes in the supplementary motor cortex in maltreated individuals. That area helps plan movements. Alterations there might reflect changes in defensive behaviors or even how emotions are expressed physically.
So it could affect reactions and emotional expression.
Potentially. And interestingly, damage there can affect processing emotional words. They also found that emotional abuse was linked to less connectivity specifically, lower betweenness, meaning it's less of a central hub for regions like the posterior middle temporal gyrus and planum temporale.
And those areas are involved in
Auditory processing, linking sounds with meaning and emotion. So this finding suggests emotional abuse might interfere with the brain's ability to fully process and represent emotions, particularly those conveyed through sound or language.
Wow. So abuse could mean heightened threat detection, but also trouble processing emotions. What about sexual abuse specifically? Any distinct findings there?
Yes, the study found a positive link between sexual abuse and the network efficiency of the posterior temporal fusiform cortex.
Okay, and that area is involved in?
It's known for face recognition, but it's also thought to be involved in our sense of self, our body image, and, again, ego defense mechanisms. So this finding might align with how sexual abuse can profoundly disrupt self-perception and coping.
This is painting such a complex picture. Different traumas, potentially different neural pathways affected. Now, we touched on this, but it's so critical. How does this history impact treatment?
Yeah, this is a really important piece of the puzzle. And unfortunately, the research generally indicates that adults with a history of early life stress often show a poorer response to standard mental health treatments.
Poorer response to both medication and therapy.
Yes, compared to those without that history, it's a significant challenge.
That's crucial for clinicians to know. What have the studies specifically shown?
Well, a major meta-analysis looking at clinical trials found that depressed patients who had experienced childhood maltreatment had higher rates of non-remission, meaning the treatment didn't fully work, and just generally responded less well to antidepressants and Acta psychotherapies.
So the standard approaches might just be less effective for them.
That seems to be the case, suggesting we might need different or augmented strategies.
Are there specific examples? Like for specific treatments?
Yes. For example, the ISPI study from 2016 looked at the antidepressant sertraline. They found that adults with major depression who reported experiencing childhood abuse specifically between ages 4 and 7 had a profoundly poorer response.
Profoundly poorer. How much difference?
It was striking. Only about 7% of those individuals remitted, compared to around 32% of those without that specific early abuse history. A huge difference in response to the same drug.
Wow, that's a massive difference. So why? What could be the underlying reasons for these treatment challenges? Are there potential biological mechanisms?
Researchers are exploring several possibilities. One involves potential long-term neurobiological consequences of ELS, like actual measurable changes in brain structure, not just function.
Physical changes in the brain.
Yes, and another area is increased inflammation. Some studies, for instance, found higher levels of inflammatory markers like IL-6 in depressed men with a history of ELS, especially when they were put under stress.
So it could be changing body chemistry too, like inflammation levels.
Exactly. It suggests the effects are systemic, not just psychological. And then there's the whole area of genetics and, crucially, epigenetics.
Okay, epigenetics, that's about how our experiences can change how our genes work, right?
Precisely. It's not changing the DNA sequence itself, but changing gene expression, which genes get turned on or off. We know genetic variations in neurotransmitter systems might make some people more vulnerable. Epigenetics shows how trauma can leave a lasting mark on how those genes function.
Can you give an example of that gene-environment interaction?
Sure, there's a gene called FKBP5 involved in the stress response system. Variations in this gene are linked to PTSD risk, but that link seems much stronger in people who also experience childhood trauma.
Ah, so the gene plus the experience.
Right. And it looks like this interaction is mediated by epigenetic changes specifically, something called demethylation affecting that FKBP5 gene. It's a prime example of how biology and early experience intertwine to shape long-term risk.
It really underscores how deep and lasting these impacts can be: brain function, treatment response, even down to how our genes are expressed.
Okay, let's try and bring this all together. Can we quickly recap the main takeaways?
Absolutely. I think the key points are: first, there's a strong, consistent link between various kinds of childhood trauma, abuse, neglect, bullying, and a higher risk of adult mental health disorders like depression, anxiety, and psychosis.
Right. That link is clear.
Second, different types of trauma, specifically neglect versus abuse, might lead to distinct long-term changes in brain function, affecting regions involved in emotion, cognition, and self-regulation.
Different impacts on the brain. Got it.
And third, and really crucially for care, individuals with a history of early life stress often face significant challenges in responding effectively to standard mental health treatments, both medication and therapy.
Okay. And why is understanding all this so important for you listening right now? Well, I think understanding these connections is just vital. It really highlights how important early identification is and the need to develop more tailored, more effective interventions for people who have experienced trauma.
It's not one size fits all.
Not at all. And it also points to the urgent need for more attention and timely psychological support for maltreated children to try and mitigate some of these long-term risks before they become entrenched.
It really brings home that idea, doesn't it?
Mm.
What happens in our earliest years isn't just in the past. It can fundamentally shape our biology, our minds, our well-being.
Mm-hmm.
So on that note, here's something to really think about. If different forms of childhood trauma can carve these distinct paths in the brain, how might future therapies evolve? Could we actually personalize treatments to target those specific neurobiological changes, offering more precise, maybe more effective help for those who've lived through early adversity?